This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Writer Life podcast. I'm feeling a little bit nostalgic today. I've been looking through some of the many things that I've written over the years, some of which have appeared on blogs, some which have just been filed away and forgotten. And I've been digging through the pile and I came across something that I wrote as part of one of my Christmas celebrations a good few years ago now, under the guise of the Author's Kingdom. And as I seem to remember, I think that year I wrote 24 blogs, one a day, and I put them out over the Christmas period for Heirs the Kingdom readers to have a look through, as I explained a lot of the back history and how Heirs to the Kingdom actually came about. Now, I mean, for a reader or even for a young starting out new writer, I suppose in many ways some of my working practices would be useful to help give deeper understanding to the reader and maybe a useful guide for a young writer. And so today I want to look back at one of those articles, which the article was actually called Creating Locksley in the Woodland Realm. And it shows how I kind of came up with the idea and how I kind of got obsessed with it and ended up making thousands of notes, which led to the writing of the series of books. Now, for those listening who don't really know me, the Woodland Realm of the United Kingdom, it has a very precious and very important place in my life. From the age of 5, I've had the luxury of being able to just slip over the garden fence and walk in amongst the trees of a wild woodland. And it's a place to which I hold a great affinity. For me personally, the trees are massively important life form, and I see it as the symbol of life itself and the true form to which I identify pretty much most of the natural world. When I first began to write Heirs to the Kingdom, I was told not to give the book the title of The Bowman of Locksley, because people would think it was just another Robin Hood story. And for those of you who've read it, you all pretty much have worked out by now that it most certainly is nothing at all like that. The story is indeed inspired by a few of my favourite stories from childhood. Firstly, my love of King Arthur and Merlin, combined with the tales of Robin Hood, and more than that, also my love of books, from a wide wealth of genres, such as Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, The Swiss Family Robinson. All of these books at an early age inspired me so much that they left a mark on me that even to this day, it's never really left me. As I passed into my teenage days, I was captivated by books like Day of the Triffids, and The Chrysalids, which is one of my favourite stories, War of the Worlds and The Three Musketeers. I suppose in many ways as a young lad, I got hooked on post-apocalyptic tales and anything that had great camaraderie, as well as a really good survival topic. I still love all things that involve living an alternative life within nature, going off grid and leaving the modern world behind me. I find the modern world at times to be quite tiresome. I see it as a world that values possessions and money far more than humanity and compassion. And with the addition of social media, it really does at times, it's like all people want these days is to be validated for actually doing very little. Let's be honest, posting 1,000 selfies is hardly an achievement. I cannot deny there's been moments when I've sat and watched the world and thought maybe mankind should just end tomorrow before we ruin everything that is surviving and barely at the moment on this planet. I just feel the huge urge to build a tree house at times and just go live alone in the woodlands, where I think actually, to be honest, I would be surprisingly happy alone. Of course, That then leads me into thinking about what would happen if a massive disaster wiped out most of us, and what if suddenly all the power was cut off? I mean, could modern people honestly survive? Have we salvaged enough of the arts and the craft skills from the past, or in growing techniques, to really make it and then continue the human race onwards? It's always been at moments like this, these moments of thought, that in my youth that I began to play out different scenarios in my head. It's actually a brilliant topic of thought, and if you give it some time and you think about it deeply, you can really look at a million different combinations of how life after destruction would actually look. And I suppose in many, many ways, for me personally, Heirs to the Kingdom is just one of many different ways. If you take that scenario and then you add that to the end of one of my favourite books, which is King Arthur, which clearly states he's going to return one day to save us all, which has been, to be honest, a popular theme throughout the mythology of all of history, even religion. I mean, if you look at the Bible, it's the same theme. One of these days, Christ will arise and come back and save all of humanity. You can pretty much see, really, when you consider that, where Heirs to the Kingdom began. My ponderings of all of the above scenarios were eventually going to splice at some point, which was actually, for me personally, somewhere around the very early 1980s. When I first began to look at how I would set up the world that I've now created, I hadn't really decided on what had actually caused the end of modern mankind. I started at the heart of it all, and so I selected what would be a farm, as I knew that if I had a remote location and the ability to produce food, it would be vastly important to the survival of a race. It was also clear to me, just by looking at modern news broadcasts, if we ever really do have a massive disaster on this planet, cities would be the last place that anybody would want to be. I know from my own horticultural experience that most crops are sown between January and March, depending on which crops they actually are. And so it was clear to me, to have any chance of making this plausible, the tragic event, whatever it would be, it had to take place from April onwards. And that really was where Heirs to the Kingdom, as a seed, germinated into what we now read. It's amazing what you can learn if you dig deep enough. Most people use the internet for social media, for posting pictures and trying to stay in contact with each other whilst fighting their way through what is now like platforms filled with suggested posts and adverts. But, as I did some research, I took a really good look at what I actually had in note form. I had a farm, and so with a little extra research on the internet, which is an amazing resource, I find some really old records from Loxley on the border of Derbyshire and Yorkshire, which showed that in the 1600s, an archaeological dig unearthed 14 dwellings, which were pretty close together and dated back as far as the early medieval period. The lord at the time who conducted the dig said he found evidence that this was the actual home of Robert of Barnsdale, which is the area at that time in which today's Loxley now sits. So it appears that the young son of a local shot his neighbour's dog for killing some of the sheep using his longbow, when he was actually fined a penny by the Barnsdale magistrate. But he didn't pay it because he absconded into the large bordering Sherwood forest, and he was then, because of it, branded an outlaw. If you look at really old maps, they actually show that Sherwood Forest was far greater than it actually is today. In fact, not only did it cover most of Nottingham, it spread across a great deal of Derbyshire and into Yorkshire as well. The whole of the area of Barnsdale was in later days divided into small hamlets, of which the one in that area was actually named Loxley, is actually still there today. You can actually go to it and visit it. It was perfect. And so I now had a farm and 14 houses to build my story around. And from that point on, with more research and an awful lot of creative license, I created what the readers now know to be the stockade belonging to the Locks family in Locksley. I started initially with a family tree. I put the head of the Locks household, Jake, at the very top of it. I added his wife, and then I began to work on his 3 sons and their family. Now, Jake was the landowner, and the eldest son had to be the parent of Robbie, who at that point in my mind was still actually a very, very young boy. That gave me the occupants of the farm, which was, a big operation. And so then I added a few members of staff, of which Anne Kirk and Agatha Patterdale both ended up working for Jake and lived in 2 of the 14 houses. Much later in the development of the story, that was to change, and they became business owners and tenants of Jake. Alf Smith, the butcher, came next, followed by the Appleton family, who were the herders of the livestock. And slowly, the circle of people within Locksley expanded, at which point I came up with my reason for the introduction of runestone to the stockade, via her mother moving in and setting up her own shop, Trinkets and Trousers. It was a shop that sold jewellery, clothing, and lots of little fashionable accessories. I wrote the part of the meeting between Robbie and Runestone at her gate in the very, very early days. But it wasn't until I actually started to write the 5th book that I decided to dig out this very small piece that I'd noted down in the early 1980s. And I gave it a full makeover to update it so that it would then fit better with what had actually become a very, very fast evolving and very organic storyline. The actual idea of creating the stockade came in 2005. And it was not actually very long before I actually started the massive task of arranging all of the notes, which would come a year later. It occurred to me that at some point Robbie would need to be pushed into the limelight, and even though all of my notes to that point had actually aged him as only 12 years old, and Runestone at that point in the writing or the creation was only 11 years old, I knew that if I was going to make the story have a more believable factor, I had to have a lead character that could actually take the people forward. So it was at this time that I decided Jake had to leave the story and make way for his son Robert, who would eventually pass the title on to his heir. So the story that evolved behind the scenes, which was the death of old Jake Locks, and Robbie was aged to almost 18 years of age, literally happened overnight. It made sense that if the community was falling apart and you had a large property filled with fields of food, you'd be open to raids, and those of a much more violent nature. And so for me, creating Jake as being a really smart man, he then decided to begin to erect a wall from the vast forests of pine and fir that were surrounding him. I mean, it was pretty clear it would be hard and grueling work, especially in a survival situation. And it was obvious to me that a man like Jake would offer support to others around him. Having lived there all of his life, he'd be pretty well known in the area. And I thought he would be the kind of type of man to gather those in need together on his property to protect them. But also he would actually need the extra help. So by the time he began his wall of tree trunks, there would have been no shortage of willing hands. Now all of this was very carefully worked into the background via small short stories, which eventually led to the accident with Jake that ultimately caused his demise. Even though I was creating this story, I pretty much used Heirs to the Kingdom as a working title, and so I was always aware that this was going to be the tale that slowly reduced the cast members to those final few remaining heirs. I suppose in one way, I always considered the point that once I reached those final few, I could then create another continuing tale of those who came later if I needed to. Although I've got to say at this point, it's not something I've really done an awful lot of work on to date. I have somewhat jumped the gun, and I've gone backwards rather than forwards as I look to the past and to the start of this series, which has now been published in the form of Rise of the Raven. Just recently, I released the continuation of what has now become a new story arc that runs parallel with Heirs to the Kingdom, as it documents the life of Morgana of Cornwall and her journey from innocence to becoming the dark and feared character we all see in Heirs to the Kingdom. I think all those years ago now, as I planned and daydreamed in my spare time, I found myself really getting into the idea of setting up my own farm commune. It was a powerful idea that really inspired me. I laugh a little as I think back now. I worked in horticulture at a large garden centre at the time, and there were many hours of long, laborious tasks to do, especially in early spring. It was on those times alone in a greenhouse I'd let my mind wander as I pricked out seedlings or potted hundreds of plants up. It was some of my happiest times alone in the greenhouse, working on planting up hanging baskets or lining out the floors with thousands of fresh new seedlings. It was the kind of work where you just get on with it, because the routine was such that you worked in a way on autopilot. And that was wonderful, as it allowed my thoughts to wander. Every night I made notes in a scruffy old pad, and in many ways this was just a way to distract my constantly busy mind, as this imaginary village set on the moors got more and more elaborate. I can honestly say I never once considered what I was doing. This was just some sort of way to control the endless internal dialogue of my busy brain, and it was never really meant to be published. In April 1993, I got the flu, and I was really ill. I'd watched how we'd lost members of staff at work to sick leave, and had just taken up the slack with other members of our team to just cope until we were better. But this flu was pretty different, and we struggled for a good few weeks with low staff numbers, and it left me exhausted. One Sunday night, after a very long day and feeling really tired, as I prepared for work, I climbed into bed feeling really achy and weary. To my surprise, I woke up on Wednesday morning feeling really rough. My partner at the time told me of how I turned almost white as I burned with a fever for 2 days, and she was greatly relieved to see me awake, even if I was coughing and sneezing like a madman. Once recovered and back in work, I was amazed at how I'd slept for 2 days without even being aware of it. I understood that this flu had just hit me out of nowhere, and I think that was the moment when I realised how susceptible we all are to virus infections. It was during the months that followed that I began to read of the great flu epidemic that wiped out millions. And so I started to understand that in a way I'd found my way to explain how Loxley had become such an isolated place. It was around this time when the Red Death entered into my thoughts. Just as always, I took a fact and I blended it with a little fiction, and then I worked out the stages at which the virus would spread and incubate to create a scenario that could be applied to my now pretty fast growing village of people and notes. The picture was beginning to widen as my virus swept across the country, and finally I had a great backdrop for my small community. Possibly the oddest thing was, when I did eventually start to write Heirs to the Kingdom, the Red Death was just a loose definition, even though I had a good amount of notes on it. The detail came much later, and was included at the start of Book 5, and written from the point of view of looking backwards at the events of that time. It's funny really, because when 2020 came along, and we were all hit by that dreaded disease, that the world came to a standstill. I'll not deny, I got a few chills as I watched online how the world was driven by panic, and I saw many reflections of my writing in Book 5 actually come to life before my very eyes. I guess we're lucky, because it was nowhere near as infectious as my depiction of the Red Death. But I'll not deny, it was pretty scary at times seeing how close I actually got to a real pandemic scenario. I'm not really sure where the date 2012 really came from. I know I wrote it on my file in 1989 in red marker pen. It could have been something I read, I really cannot remember, but for some unexplained reason that was this date that was burned into my mind, and I never really felt much of a need to change it, as this was not something I'd ever thought of publishing. Parts of my notes were extensive family trees with dates that went right back to the times of King Arthur. I literally listed every fictitious member of the family and who they married and who their children were. I can giggle now when I look back at it and think, God, how obsessed was I back then? The timeline it provides has been an incredible working tool as I wrote through the series of books. So even though I think of myself at times as being quite bonkers in the way in which I sort of create behind the scenes, it has actually served me really, really well. And it's the most used tool in my notes stack. Shortly after I published the first version of Heirs to the Kingdom, I realised it was 2009, and it was only actually 3 years short of the actual fictional event. I think with hindsight, maybe I should have changed it. The problem was that once I started working on the story, the task of changing the timeline and then changing the manuscripts to fit the amended dates was just simply too mammoth to carry out. And so it's remained as originally written. I suppose in some way I've always seen it as sort of an alternative timeline, maybe what could have been, almost like a parallel universe, with a really good reason for world change, a good community growing daily, and my lead characters aged to fit the narrative in place, and with a kind of fictitious history behind them from the distant mythical tales. I had most of my imaginary world at that time in place. Between the year 2000 and 2005, I spent a lot of time filling in gaps. I looked at the world through slightly destructive eyes as I pulled it apart to see what would last and what would fall. I hit the books and I studied the growth rates of plants, the destructive powers of earthquakes, and how the weather could bring damage and chaos. And I devoured books on plagues, viruses, HIV, mad cow's disease, chicken flu. I'm pretty sure at the time my local library saw me as some sort of wild villain looking to kill off most of the planet. I added religion in the form of a slightly altered and updated pagan-bathed faith. I looked into alternative energy, natural fuels, and ancient weapons, and as I learned more, I penciled it in between the lines. So by 2006, I had a huge mountain of notes, all scribbled on pads and crammed into my old metal filing cabinet. It was a mess, and so I decided I would finally start to sort it all out and get organised. Shortly before Christmas of 2005, I bought a really old second-hand PC computer. It was old and it needed a good cleaning out, but it worked and it had a word processor, which, to be honest, was all I really wanted. After a few updates and a much more advanced copy of Windows installing on it, it was ready to use. On New Year's Day, I switched on the computer and I opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet, and I began to type up all of the handwritten notes, creating files to store them as I went. It took almost a year to actually type it all up and file it where I could find it quite quickly. It did not help that once I began, I also started to make more additions, as the process was a really creative one, and the size of the task actually doubled in size. Eventually the task was done. My battered and slightly out-of-date computer became my first real vehicle for writing properly, and although I typed with only 2 fingers at the time, I rapidly became a very fast and efficient typist, something that has not really changed a great much today, as I rarely use more than 3 fingers. Even though I've since added a more up-to-date desktop and laptop computers for editing on, and I've definitely brought in a lot more advanced programs, that first computer really became my only writing computer for Heirs to the Kingdom. Sadly, I got the first six and half of book 7 out of it before it burned out completely in 2014. But it served me really, really well over time. And in honour of my wonderfully battered and kind of old, knackered PC, I replaced it with yet another second-hand computer, just to keep that very familiar feel. I very much like the idea of using old technology for writing this story on, and I've always felt that somewhere in Harry's shed is an old PC just waiting for him to find it and tinker with it to get it going again. And you never know, maybe one day Blades will use it to write her side of the story of what it was like growing up with Mad Harry as her father and becoming the very first new recruit to the Specialists of Locksley. Finally, with the task completed, which also involved many small backstories from the past, I had enough material to really seriously consider starting. What had begun as a daydream was now a whole race of woodland-dwelling people who lived a sustainable life on the land and worked hard to survive in peace. I had the stockade protected by the landowner, I had the food, the salvage technology to assist, and a whole bag of interesting character profiles to introduce into the story as and when I actually needed them. The woodland realm had finally taken on its first very true shape. In May 2007, with a computer filled with neatly ordered notes, I sat back and I began to write. Locksley is the town, set deep in the wild moor. And I was off. Above my desk was a map of my Locksley, a family tree that spanned 4 feet by 3 feet wide, and in my mind was a picture of snow on a farmhouse that had a huge industrial greenhouse set away from the back door. Beside it was a barn that rang to the sound of steel, and in the distance behind the now bare rows of apple trees, you could just make out the distant silhouette of a tall wooden wall. Behind me was the long driveway that led down a hawthorn-clad lane, and that took me through the crisp white snow to the cold, empty streets of 14 houses, where only a few occupants had risen to start the cold, wintry day. Years of scribbling notes and filing suddenly came alive as I took the best part of 20 years' worth of work, and just as Eve did so long ago, I breathed life into it, and I set it free to grow and evolve as it wished. This was going to be my kingdom, and a world that I personally would love to walk around in. It felt like an extraordinary feeling as I wrote. I combined all those wonderful moments of my childhood alone in the woodland, and every little dirt path I ran along became a road in my story. All the hidden paths I knew between the trees became the routes taken by my specialists. The steep embankments I struggled up were the same ones my hero climbed to hunt and look out across the now deserted, tree-filled landscape. And all those trees I loved to climb when I was a kid, which are still some of my all-time favourite trees, became the prominent trees of my story. Each and every step my characters took, I could see as clear as watching video in my mind, and it all became the foundation on which I would build a really, really long, I suppose, greatly layered story. It probably sounds quite selfish, but at the time it was my story. I guarded it and kept it to myself. Literally no other living soul knew about it, not even my parents. It was so precious and special, and it was just for me. And at that time I had absolutely no intention at all of sharing it. That was to come a little later when, quite by accident, I mentioned I'd written something to an employee I had. But that it's not a tale, that's not really a tale for now. The result is pretty much now known. I eventually submitted under pressure to share it, and as a result, after a lot of convincing, very, very reluctantly, I published The Bowman of Locksley. Now, from my own point of view, I've not really considered what being a writer is. I suppose it's something that I've naturally fallen into. I look at the world today and I see the wealth of writers that are all around me, and whereas I used to see them as these untouchable people, I think I now understand that, like myself, they too have this internal desire to express the chaos of their minds in a written form. There's a really deep satisfaction in the process of starting from scratch and then slowly layering together all of the facts and building up a world that, even though it's make-believe, it feels as realistic as the one that we all live in. I've given many hours to the kingdom, and it's proven to be one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, especially considering that today others may walk within it. There's no doubt that isolation plays a big role in writing, and also I think putting yourself in any form in front of the world can breed some deep insecurity. And yet I think, finally, after years of non-stop work, I can say I really do think it was all being worthwhile. Because at the end of the day, I love this stuff. I love creating these stories. I'm at my happiest with a desk full of pads and 4 computer screens open, researching stuff and pulling things together. And I'm quite sure there's more to come. I'm already working on a brand new world and a brand new fantasy with completely different characters and a completely different way of being. I think it's just a part of me. I think it's a part of me that basically for years yearned to come out, which is probably why it kind of held such power in my mind for so long. Even when working in other jobs, I had Heirs to the Kingdom living inside my head. In any quiet moments I had, I'd be thinking, ooh, that's a good idea. Yeah, I could pull that in. And yeah, we should do that. So maybe it's just maybe it's a writer's thing. I don't know. There may be young writers out there who really understand that. There may be readers out there who really get it. I just know that the creation of Heirs to the Kingdom, it's been an epic part of my life. It's taken well over 30 years of my life up. And it's a piece of work, a body of work that I've become incredibly proud of, especially since I finished it and moved on to other kinds of stories, such as The Curios or Hans Cottage or Rise of the Raven. There's a great joy to creation. There's a joy to writing. I can remember once being told, if you want to be happy in this world, you want to have a happy life, then focus on what you can create, because it's within the process of creation that we find our greatest joy. And for me personally, that really, really does ring true. And I hope that those out there reading the stories, enjoying the stories that I put out there, I hope that they can listen to this and understand the wealth of work that's gone in behind the scenes, and that in a way probably makes the books a little more fun when they read it. As always, if you've listened to me bang on throughout this podcast and you're still here listening, thank you very, very much for taking some time and pulling up the podcast and listening. It's massively appreciated. Again, if you do enjoy the kind of content that I'm putting out about my writing, and please, if you can, subscribe to the channel, like a few videos, show them some love, so that I can get the viral reach a lot wider, and then more people who like the kind of things that I write about, they'll hear about me and they can come and have a listen, and hopefully they too will walk in the kingdom or travel with the curios or sit with the fairies in Hans Cottage. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week with another podcast, and until such time, take care, live well, and have fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.